I once had a teacher, he was a priest, who one day walked into the classroom and told us, his students, something like this. Okay, now, before we begin today, I need to tell you something. If you do not love me more than your parents and your siblings and your best friends, you can't be my student. Well, he said that with a completely serious expression, and we all thought he was crazy or something, because what he was saying was really very, very strange, kind of gross if you think about it. And if we'd taken him seriously, doing what he was demanding would require a level of commitment and a love for him that we would have never, ever considered. That's because people just do not make that kind of claim on us. And so for that reason, we could not take his statements as sincere. And as it turns out, he was kidding us, but he was trying to make a point about the gospel reading that we just heard. Now, for the last few weeks, our gospel readings have been coming from what is known as Matthew's missionary discourse. And this is a section in that gospel that contains Jesus' instructions that he's giving to his apostles just before he sends them out on missions to proclaim the good news of the coming of the kingdom of God. And Jesus was setting up the apostles to carry on his mission to the rest of the earth once he departed. Now, you might remember last week that Jesus was addressing the apostles' very real fears about being sent out on their own without Jesus, and about opening themselves up to slander and persecution. And he told them to fear no one except for God. And he told them that their fear of God should be based on a fear of offending God through sinning, because God is so good and so holy and such a loving Father. Well, today he takes it a step further in telling them something about himself. And he makes this shocking statement: whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. In other words, that person isn't worthy to be his disciple. Now, this would have come as an extremely radical notion for those apostles who knew and lived the Ten Commandments all their lives. And you'll remember that the first three of the commandments dealt with God, honoring God and not speaking bad about God and that sort of thing. But the second set of commandments begins with honor your father and your mother. We use the word honor, but it's probably better translated as glorify or to give glory. And honoring your parents was like the most basic commandment in your relationship with all other people. And so your first obligation that you have as a human being was to give glory and honor to the two that gave life to you, your mother and your father. And so here's Jesus, a rabbi and a teacher and a prophet, telling his apostles that their love for him must be stronger than the love that they show their parents. And then he goes on to say that any person who loves a son or a daughter more than him isn't worthy to follow him either, of being his disciple. And here's the thing. It's really quite natural for moms and dads to put their children at the very center of their lives and to love their children above all others. Is that right? Yes? Well, now here's Jesus saying that you can't love your kids more than you love him. Now this would have been, for the apostles, a very, very strange thing to hear. And they'd be asking themselves, just who is this Jesus to make these kinds of demands? Well, the apostles would have understood what Jesus was getting at. Each one of them would have understood what Jesus was really saying, because they knew there's only one who can make that kind of demand that Jesus was demanding. That would be God himself. They'd have known this because they prayed the great prayer of the Old Testament several times a day, which goes like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Now, somewhere else in the gospel, Jesus calls this all our soul and all our strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he's telling the apostles that he, Jesus, wants them to love him in just the way that they are to love God. So in telling the apostles this, Jesus is revealing to them that he is a divine person, that he is God, because he's demanding something that only God can demand from his followers, and that's a radical and extreme love. And remember, just a few sentences before, he was addressing their fears about persecution and martyrdom. And now here he is in today's gospel telling them that they'll have to be willing to be persecuted and maybe even killed in taking up their crosses. He's putting suffering and acceptance of suffering as a kind of benchmark for being his follower. And he's pointing to the cross as the symbol of their discipleship, because Jesus intends to transform suffering into love. And as he tells us, that kind of love is the way to heaven. And you can imagine that the apostles, who were already quite afraid, they must have really wondered why they had signed up for all of this. Jesus has just spoken to them as God and promised them persecution. That's a bit much, don't you think? And yet, with the exception of Judas, who would commit suicide, and maybe John, all the rest of the apostles took Jesus at his word, and they believed that he was God in the flesh, and each one of them would eventually be martyred for the faith that they were living and bringing to the people. It's incredible if you think about it for just only a minute, that the entire history of the Christian church is full of people who have taken Jesus seriously at his word and loved him as he asked the apostles to love him. Well, following Jesus is not an easy thing to do because it can involve a very high cost, and that's a complete surrender to Jesus, and not to mention loving our neighbors, some of whom are not very lovable. But if we love the Lord as he asks, all else will fall into its proper order, and we will find the fullness of life, the life that will last forever. And it begins here on earth when we begin to love God as he made us to love him. Have a good weekend, everybody.